If you look at the national debt clock in Times Square or pull up the official numbers from the U.S. Treasury, you will see a figure so large it barely registers as real. It is moving past levels that would have sounded insane just a generation ago, and it is heading toward $38 trillion. That number is so big that most people stop thinking about it the moment they hear it. It becomes background noise, a statistic, a headline, something for economists to argue about on television, but that is exactly how dangerous numbers work. They become so large, so abstract, that the public stops treating them like reality. And then one day, reality arrives anyway. For decades, Americans were told not to worry about the debt. We were told deficits do not matter. We were told the United States can always borrow more because it issues the world's reserve currency. We were told the debt is manageable, the bond market is stable, and the system is under control. That story worked when interest rates were near zero. It worked when inflation was dormant. It worked when borrowing felt free. But that era is over. Today, the debt is no longer just a political talking point. It is no longer just a scoreboard number that rises in the background while Washington keeps pretending everything is normal. It has become an active force inside the federal budget, a predator, a compounding machine that is beginning to consume the government from within. For the first time in modern history, the United States is spending staggering amounts of money just to service the debt it already has. Not to build roads, not to fund research, not to strengthen the country, just to pay interest, just to feed the past. Think about what that means. The government borrowed massively for years, and now a growing share of tax revenue is being diverted away from the future and sent backward into obligations that have already been made. The country is increasingly working not to create prosperity, but to finance yesterday. That is the moment where debt stops being theoretical, and once you reach that moment, the normal answers start to disappear. In a household, too much debt leads to painful but simple decisions. You cut spending, you sell assets, you take a second job, you stop pretending. But a sovereign government is not a household, and the United States is not dealing with a temporary cash flow problem. It is dealing with a structural trap. A huge share of federal spending is politically untouchable: Social Security, Medicare, defense commitments, interest itself. These are not expenses Washington can casually slash without detonating a political crisis. Every major line item has a constituency. Every promise has voters attached to it. Every cut has consequences. So when the bills rise, the government does not respond the way a family would. It does not meaningfully shrink. It borrows again. And that is where the spiral begins. To pay interest on old debt, it issues new debt. That new debt adds to the total. The larger total creates larger interest costs next year. Those larger interest costs require more borrowing. More borrowing creates more debt. More debt creates more interest. It is a feedback loop, and once the numbers are big enough, it starts to accelerate under its own weight. This is the trap almost nobody wants to say out loud. At this scale, there is no painless solution. There is no clever accounting trick. There is no spreadsheet magic. There are only bad options, worse options, and one politically convenient option that governments throughout history almost always choose. Let's walk through them. Option 1 is austerity. This is the honest answer. Raise taxes hard, cut spending hard, stop the bleed. Force the country to live within its means and begin paying down the debt burden over time. In theory, this is how a responsible state behaves. In practice, it is political suicide. Austerity at the level required to meaningfully change the American debt trajectory would be brutal. It would mean deep reductions in programs millions of people depend on. It would mean slower growth, higher unemployment, lower asset prices, and enormous public anger. Politicians do not get elected by promising pain on purpose. They get elected by promising relief, protection, and more benefits than the other side. So, austerity remains the answer that everyone praises in theory and rejects in reality. Option 2 is explicit default. The government could admit the game is over and refuse to honor its obligations in full. That is what weaker states do when they run out of room. They restructure, they delay payment, they impose losses, they break the contract. But for the United States, this is the nuclear option. The global financial system is built on the assumption that U.S. Treasury debt is the safest collateral on Earth. Banks rely on it, pension funds rely on it, insurers rely on it, international trade relies on it, dollar reserves rely on it. If the United States openly defaulted, the shock would rip through every major institution in the world. Funding markets would seize, confidence would collapse, the illusion of a risk-free foundation would vanish overnight. Washington cannot choose that path unless it is prepared to break the system it sits on top of. So if austerity is politically impossible and default is systemically catastrophic, what remains? The answer is the oldest trick in the imperial playbook. You do not refuse to pay the debt, you pay it, every dollar, every bond, every coupon. You honor the contract in nominal terms while quietly destroying the value of the currency used to settle it. This is the soft default. It does not look like default because the numbers still get paid, bondholders still receive dollars, entitlements still go out, treasury auctions still clear, the machine keeps running. But the dollars being returned buy less. They command less labor, less energy, less housing, less food, less life. The contract is fulfilled in form and broken in substance. That is how a state erases debt without ever admitting it is erasing debt. Inflation is not just a policy failure in this environment, it is a policy solution. If the government owes tens of trillions of dollars and the purchasing power of the dollar falls year after year, the real burden of that debt shrinks. The nominal total may keep rising, but what matters is the debt in real terms. If wages, prices, and asset values inflate while old debt remains fixed in dollars, the state can slowly liquidate the burden through devaluation. This is the path of least resistance because it spreads the pain invisibly. Austerity creates riots. Default creates panic. Inflation creates confusion. People feel poorer, but they struggle to identify the exact moment of theft. They blame corporations. They blame supply chains. They blame housing shortages, foreign wars, greedy landlords, weather, gas stations, anyone but the architecture of the monetary system itself. Inflation is politically powerful because it masks responsibility. It turns policy into atmosphere, and that is why governments love it. Now here is where this story becomes more dangerous. Inflation alone is not enough. If interest rates rise too high while debt is enormous, the cost of servicing that debt explodes. So the government needs a very specific environment. It needs inflation that runs hot enough to reduce the real debt burden, but interest rates that stay low enough to keep the government itself from being crushed by financing costs. That gap is everything. The state needs rates below true inflation. It needs savers to lose quietly. It needs bondholders to accept returns that look positive on paper but are negative in purchasing power terms. It needs the public to focus on nominal numbers while the real transfer happens underneath. This system has a name. It is called financial repression. Financial repression is how debt-heavy governments trap capital inside the system and slowly siphon value from it. It is not one policy, it is a whole environment, a combination of inflation, regulation, rate management, institutional coercion, and narrative control designed to make the state solvent by making everyone else poorer in slow motion. And once you understand that, the last few years start to look very different. You start to see why inflation can remain stubbornly high while policymakers speak in reassuring tones. You start to see why real yields matter more than official talking points. You start to see why the system does not truly want sound money. It wants manageable decay, because manageable decay is governable. Now let's go deeper into the machinery. The first mechanism is simple: create captive buyers for government debt. In a real free market, reckless borrowing gets punished. If a borrower is drowning in obligations and shows no sign of restraint, lenders demand a higher return. Risk goes up, so the interest rate goes up. That is how honest markets impose discipline. But the United States cannot afford fully honest pricing on its debt forever. Not at this scale. So instead of relying on free demand, the system creates forced demand. Banks, insurance companies, pension funds, money market structures, reserve managers, regulated institutions across the entire financial architecture are pushed toward holding government debt because the rules are built that way. Treasuries are treated as pristine collateral, as safe assets, as mandatory ballast. The state does not just borrow from the market, it designs the market around its own borrowing needs. That means demand is not always organic. Often it is engineered. When institutions are required, incentivized, or heavily nudged to hold government paper, yields stay lower than they otherwise would. The debt remains financeable. The appearance of stability survives, but what looks like confidence may actually be compulsion. The second mechanism is narrative management around inflation itself. If too many payments are tied to the cost of living, then measuring inflation accurately becomes expensive for the government. Higher official inflation means bigger benefit adjustments, higher index payouts, higher political pressure, and a clearer public understanding that the currency is being degraded. So there is always an incentive to make inflation appear narrower, softer, or more temporary than ordinary people experience in daily life. This is where the battle over definitions begins. What counts in the basket, what gets substituted, how quality adjustments are applied, how shelter is measured, which time windows are emphasized. None of this is neutral. The methodology shapes the story, and the story shapes the political response. If people are told inflation is cooling while their rent, food, insurance, and utilities keep rising faster than their income, something important happens. They begin to distrust their own senses. The official number and lived reality drift apart, and in that gap, the state buys time. The third mechanism is the loss of central bank independence under debt pressure. For decades, the mythology of modern finance rested on the idea that the central bank stood above politics. Its job was to defend price stability even when doing so was painful. Raise rates if inflation emerges, tighten financial conditions if the economy overheats, protect the currency first. That model only works when the debt burden is manageable. Once the debt becomes too large, aggressive rate hikes stop being merely painful. They become existential. Every percentage point matters, every rollover matters, every refinancing cycle matters. At some level, fighting inflation honestly begins to threaten the solvency of the state itself, and when that moment arrives, the hierarchy changes. The central bank may still speak the language of independence, but the fiscal reality starts calling the shots. Policy becomes less about what is ideal for the currency and more about what is survivable for the treasury. Inflation is tolerated longer. Real rates stay too low for too long. Asset markets are protected because market collapse would feed back into deficits, unemployment, and political instability. This is fiscal dominance, and fiscal dominance changes everything. It means the debt is no longer just an outcome of policy. It becomes the constraint that governs all future policy. It becomes the invisible ceiling above every rate decision, every stimulus package, every budget fight, every market rescue. The state can pretend it still has optionality, but in truth, the debt is increasingly steering the machine. Now ask yourself what this does to the average saver. If inflation runs above the return on cash, cash is being taxed without legislation. If bonds yield less than the true rate of monetary erosion, supposedly safe investments become instruments of confiscation. If home prices, stocks, and hard assets rise faster than wages, people who own assets pull away while people who live on labor fall behind. That is why this debt strategy is not just about government finance, it is about social structure. Inflating away debt does not hit everyone equally. It rewards leverage, it rewards asset ownership, it rewards proximity to newly created money, it punishes caution, it punishes savings, it punishes anyone trying to build security through discipline inside a weakening currency. That is why inequality widens in this kind of regime. When new money enters through financial channels, it reaches large institutions and asset markets first. Prices in those markets rise early, portfolios expand, real estate climbs, equity valuations stretch. Meanwhile, ordinary wages adjust later, if they adjust at all. By the time relief reaches the middle class, the purchasing power damage is already done. The people closest to the monetary spigot are compensated first. The people farthest from it pay first. That is not an accident. It is how the mechanism works. And once that dynamic becomes structural, the old rules of personal finance start to fail. The advice that worked in a lower debt, lower inflation era begins to collapse. Save in cash, buy safe bonds, trust steady compounding, be prudent, be patient. That advice assumes the currency itself is being protected. If the currency is being used as the release valve for a national debt crisis, then prudence becomes punishment. The saver becomes the donor. The careful citizen becomes the shock absorber for the state. This is how a country drifts into forced speculation. People no longer invest to build upside. They invest to escape guaranteed erosion. They buy stocks not because valuations make sense, but because cash burns. They buy real estate not because yields are attractive, but because they are trying to outrun devaluation. They buy gold, commodities, Bitcoin, anything perceived as scarce, not because all of it is safe, but because the official safe option has been made unsafe by design. That is a profound moral change in an economy. A healthy system rewards production, patience, and intelligent risk-taking. A debt-dominated inflation regime pressures everyone into defensive gambling. It transforms the economy into a race against currency decay. And once enough people realize that, social trust begins to break down, because then the system no longer feels difficult, it feels rigged, and that perception matters. A nation can survive hardship longer than it can survive the belief that the rules are fake. Now here is the most important point of all. None of this requires a dramatic collapse tomorrow. That is what makes it so dangerous. People are trained to watch for the movie version of crisis, the crash, the bank run, the emergency speech, the market shutting down. But debt liquidation through inflation is not usually cinematic. It is gradual, bureaucratic, statistical, quiet. It shows up in grocery bills, insurance renewals, rent increases, tuition spikes, smaller savings, later retirement, lower confidence, and a growing sense that normal life requires more effort for less reward. It is not a single event. It is a regime. And in many ways, a regime is harder to fight than a crash because there is no obvious moment of rebellion, only adaptation, only attrition. That is why so many people miss what is happening. They are waiting for disaster to announce itself, while the real process is already underway in slow motion. The debt will keep rising, the speeches will keep reassuring, the institutions will keep using careful language, and underneath all of it, the currency will keep doing the dirty work that the political system refuses to do openly. That is how 38 trillion disappears, not because it is repaid honestly, not because Washington suddenly becomes disciplined, not because growth alone solves the problem. It disappears because the measuring stick is being shaved down while everyone is told the table is getting bigger. And when you see it that way, the real question is no longer whether the debt can be paid. The real question is who will pay for it. Will it be paid by politicians who created it? No. Will it be paid by institutions that benefited from it? Rarely. Will it be paid by the financial architecture that enabled it? Not first. It will be paid by holders of currency, by holders of fixed income, by workers whose wages lag prices, by savers who trusted the old rules, by citizens who believed that being responsible inside the system would be enough. That is the hidden tax, that is the soft default, that is the silent eraser. And unless the structure changes in a way that history says is deeply unlikely, this is not a temporary phase. It is the path of least resistance for a debt-saturated empire trying to preserve stability without admitting the true cost of preserving it. So when you hear that the debt is manageable, ask one question. Manageable for whom? Manageable for Washington, maybe. Manageable for the bond market, for now. Manageable for institutions positioned nearest the source of money creation, but for the average citizen trying to save, plan, and preserve purchasing power across a decade of monetary repression, this is not management. It is liquidation by dilution. The United States is not going to wake up one morning and announce that it erased $38 trillion in debt. It does not need to. It only needs to keep the machine running, keep the public calm, keep nominal payments flowing, and keep the currency quietly losing just enough value for long enough that the real burden melts away in plain sight. That is how great debts die, not with honesty, not with discipline, but with depreciation. If you want to see the hidden side of wealth, power, and global finance, subscribe to my channel, Macro Wars.